Hey guys, it's Shaylin. I'm here today with another writing video. So today I'm going to be talking about a really cool topic, which is linguistic ecosystems. This is something that I've talked about in a few videos. I felt that it deserved its own dedicated video because it's a topic that I find really cool. It is kind of my own term. I'm definitely not the first person to come up with this idea. The term linguistic ecosystem is kind of the term that I came up for this. This is just a tool that I find really helpful for creating atmosphere and thinking about creating cohesive diction in my work, which is something that I love because I'm a huge nerd for words and the word choice and the writing craft of a piece. And so this is a concept that I really enjoy implementing in my work. So the linguistic ecosystem is the specific range and type of diction that is supported by a piece. It's just like in a real-life ecosystem, certain animals, plants, and insects will be found in certain ecosystems, but they can't survive in others. So in just the same way, certain words will flourish and grow and maybe be found in abundance in one of your stories, whereas some other words simply could not grow or survive there, whereas in another story you might have a completely different linguistic ecosystem that supports a completely different type of word choice. I've got all of the information in this video as well as the examples summarized in a Google Doc, which I will leave linked below if you want to review any of the information in this video. Linguistic ecosystems are also a form of unity of form and concept. It is the idea that the form, which is how you tell a story, is used in unison with the concept, the story's characters, and themes. There's what you say and there's how you say it, and ideally we want those things to be in unison, and this is one way to do that on the diction level. So skillful use of a linguistic ecosystem can create a more immersive point of view. It can be used to build character and character psychology. It can create strong atmosphere. It can add emotional texture to a piece. And it can even do thematic work by integrating the thematic elements through the word choice. However, the words that you include in a linguistic ecosystem are as important as the ones you don't include. Using words that don't fit into the linguistic ecosystem you've created can really pull the reader out of that immersion because the word feels incongruous with the piece. So linguistic ecosystems are just a really great way to create character voice, to create atmosphere, and do thematic work. So I think it's a really useful concept all around if you're trying to think about how the word choice and the diction that you choose is going to fit in with your story. So I wanted to then go into some things that are going to affect the linguistic ecosystem. So what elements of your story are going to kind of set these limits? So the first and maybe one of the most obvious is the setting, because it's naturally going to dictate what imagery and therefore what word choice is physically present in the piece. Sometimes the setting can actually be an extremely limiting force on your diction. Right now I'm working on a fantasy book that's not just set in a fantasy world, but it's also set in like a closed system, like a city that is completely cut off. So obviously there's that level of like historical limitation of what just wouldn't exist. But then because it's set in this closed system, like my protagonist has never seen a river. She's never seen most animals. The next thing that has a huge effect on your linguistic ecosystem is the protagonist or the narrator. These things are usually the same, but occasionally they are different, such as in an omniscient POV. But for the sake of this video, I'm going to speak as if the protagonist is the narrator of the story in a close POV. So unless you're writing in an omniscient POV or for some reason you have an external narrator, you are delivering the story through the protagonist's voice, seeing the world through their eyes, and so that is going to have a huge effect on the word choice that you are able to use. Your character's background, knowledge, interests, skill set, emotional state, personality, and beliefs can all have an effect on the linguistic ecosystem. If your character is a botanist, that's probably going to add a thread of, plants and botany to the linguistic ecosystem, even if the story is set in a city. This is a huge part of how you create voice and how word choice functions within voice. Next up is tone. Tone is the attitude that the story has towards itself. So a story that has a more bizarre, surreal, or somehow absurd tone might use more extreme, bizarre, or intense language. If your story has a more maybe soft or melancholic tone, you're probably going to use gentler, more subdued language. Next up is the atmosphere. Linguistic ecosystems are one of the best ways to create an immersive atmosphere. So you can think about the mood, atmosphere, and general aesthetic that you want to create and how the word choice can contribute to that. How you can create that feeling through the colors, imagery, the feel and sound of the words, and the emotions that those words evoke. And along with that, the emotions of the piece. Different words carry different emotional connotations. Just in the way that the atmosphere and tone affect the linguistic ecosystem, so does the emotional quality of the piece. The linguistic ecosystem is also going to be impacted by the themes, symbols, and motifs. Your linguistic ecosystem can actually do thematic work in a piece, which I think is super cool. If you have themes or motifs or symbols in the story, those can be patterned through the story through the word choice that you use, making them like an undercurrent in the fabric of the work's form rather than maybe just like an idea that's kind of sitting above or around the story. If your story's main theme is that it's exploring your protagonist's relationship to religion, you could use religious imagery and diction throughout, even at points in the story where that's not directly being discussed. And finally, the genre. I think this is fairly obvious. A cyberpunk sci-fi story is going to have a really different linguistic ecosystem from a contemporary rom-com or a historical family drama set in Victorian England. And that's a combination of so many of the above factors. And those are some things to think about in terms of what can kind of set those limits. Here are a few things to think about when actually implementing this idea in your story. So first of all is the feel and sound of the words. A really big part of creating a cohesive linguistic ecosystem is using the sound and feel of the words, not just their literal meaning, in order to create the atmospheric quality that you want, or the emotional quality that you want as well. Words can feel sharp, soft, brittle, round, heavy, earthy, light, quiet, intense, etc., etc., etc. Completely sometimes separate from their literal meaning. Especially if you're thinking about which synonym to pick, a lot of the time it's going to come back to how the feel of the word, the sound of the word, fits into the sentence and then into the broader scope of your story's linguistic ecosystem. Next would be the various threads of your story. A linguistic ecosystem doesn't all have to be contained within one specific topic. In most pieces, your linguistic ecosystem is going to be kind of a braid of the many different threads of your story. So one thread might come from the setting, one might come from your character's specific skill set, one might come from a central theme and motif. They should still have an element of unifying cohesion to them, but you're not just going to have like one source of the diction, if that makes sense. Next would be your protagonist's psychology and voice, which I've touched on already a few times. You can convey your character's background and interests through the linguistic ecosystem, which is like a pretty concrete thing, but you can also convey their personality. The word choice you use, and this comes back to the sound and feel, can convey if this is a more intense person, if this is a more withdrawn person. Multiple traits, because no one just has one personality trait. But you can use words that reflect and build that character's presence on the page through presence of those words and how they feel. Use words that feel the way that your protagonist's mind feels. Along with this, you have to think about the scope of the story. This is kind of the more just logistical aspect of this. Some words just may not be possible to exist in your linguistic ecosystem because they're simply outside the story's scope. They may be outside your character's scope of knowledge or the story's scope of existence, and this is especially true for more limited POVs. So for example, a child narrator, a historical or fantasy piece. You also want to think about your similes, metaphors, and just any type of analogy. A linguistic ecosystem doesn't just apply to the words, it also applies to like the imagery and poetic devices that you use. Obviously that's related to the word choice. When you're using a simile or metaphor or any kind of comparison, thinking about how that image that you're now pulling into the piece from the outside fits into your linguistic ecosystem as well as just the words you're using. And finally, you can also think about how you may shift the linguistic ecosystem across certain characters or situations. Sometimes you might have a character or a situation or a setting that is a little outside of your linguistic ecosystem. Say your story is set in a rural, small farming town, and then you introduce a businesswoman who's just come from the city. She's not of the world of the story. So you may subtly shift the linguistic ecosystem you use when talking about her to reflect her otherness, so long as the word choice is still within your character's scope of knowledge. So your linguistic ecosystem is cast over the whole story. It applies to the whole story, but it's not that it's necessarily going to be present or like visibly present in every single word. Some words will kind of carry the weight of the linguistic ecosystem more than others. All of them should be possible within the linguistic ecosystem, but some words are going to be more like the load-bearing words. Pronouns, conjunctions, prepositions, and articles will pretty much never have anything to do with the linguistic ecosystem. These are basically invisible words that can grow anywhere. So the words you most want to be paying attention to are your nouns, verbs, adjectives, and adverbs, with the nouns and verbs being the most important. So all the words in your piece should be possible within the linguistic ecosystem. Some are going to stand out more as kind of creating this overall vibe. Others may be more invisible. You're still going to have some nouns that kind of feel like they could grow anywhere, right? But you're going to have some other nouns that are much more specific to the ecosystem of this story. So let's go through some examples. I've just used my own work for these examples, even though I don't really like using my own work, if possible, to use other people's work, but I just didn't know how to do this for someone else's work. Obviously, you could go through another story and pick out the words you think are making the linguistic ecosystem, but I don't know what other people were thinking for their word choice, so I've just gone through a few of my short stories, picked out the words that I felt really created that linguistic ecosystem, kind of distilled the word choice so you can see it in contrast to other stories, and also put it next to a paragraph from the story to see kind of what that looks like within the context of the actual piece. All the full stories are linked in the description. So the first story that I looked at was Hold Me Under Till I See the Light. I wanted this story to feel pale, dreamy, kind of washed out. I wanted it to feel kind of soft and shimmery, you know, nostalgic, definitely melancholic as well. I wanted it to have a feeling of fragility. It's set in a gated religious community in the summer, and well, it's set in California, but that's not really canon, but it's set in the summer in California in the 70s. Some threads I wanted to reflect through the story were obviously the religious themes that are very present in the piece. I wanted to reflect the narrator's kind of sexual awakening that's happening throughout the piece through some very carefully picked imagery relating to the body, themes of birth and rebirth. Throughout, there's a lot of descriptions of fabric and clothing, as well as flowers and fruit and religious imagery. And throughout there's also a lot of imagery relating to cleaning yourself. The characters are always bathing. One of the characters lives in a bathroom. This story has a strong theme of cleanliness, moral cleanliness, cleanliness from sin. So going through the story, these were some of the words that I felt really created that kind of vibe. Summer, blonde, grass, vinegar, dust, kaleidoscope, fireflies, dandelion, gauze, transparent, flesh, Polaroid, cotton, stockings, chapel, pilgrims, fluff, sweet, barley, holy, khaki, angels, apples, skin, soap, lavender, sunlight, pray, ribbon, rosy, shimmer, palms, repentance, navel, blouse, hymn, roses, midriff, clavicle, peach skin, womb, chalky, felt, goat's milk, virgin, saint, potpourri, polyester, citrine, trellis, porcelain, sepia, opal, sinew, divine, heaven, floral, goddess, marble, muslin, ribs, honeysuckle. I noticed a lot of patterns in the feel of the words. To me, these words, even just saying them, I felt a lot of really soft sounds, a lot of S's, trellis, porcelain, sepia, sinew. The words just, to me, they feel very gentle. They feel kind of floaty. The sound of the words combined with the imagery. That if you want to read that in conjunction with a specific paragraph with those words highlighted, that's in the document linked below. The second story that I looked at was How to Slaughter. With this story, I wanted this piece to feel very earthy and lived in. It's set in a rural small town. It has a grittiness, but also a youthfulness to it. The main character is quite young. In many ways innocent, but also in other ways has had a really tough upbringing. So there's a shelteredness to her, I think. Animals feature really heavily in the piece, both literally in the story and also symbolically. So there's a lot of that throughout the diction. Because the main character is so young, I wanted the word choice to feel reflective of her age and environment. I really focused in this piece on choosing very specific nouns from her environment, that even if the nouns are quite specific, she would know what these things are because they are from her world. One character is the daughter of a pastor, so there's a little thread of religious imagery throughout, and then there's definitely a thread of violence throughout this piece, which you can maybe get from the title, How to Slaughter. You can definitely and should think about using the linguistic ecosystem in the title as well. So the words I pulled through this piece: noose, resin, pines, ryegrass, turkey vultures, whittle, hickories, pigeon, sun-ironed, eye bolts, bale, ringwire, hazel, silkscreen, dovetail, pelt, moth-eaten, fox, damask, railway, Bible, penny nails, wheelbarrow, rust, landline, shepherd, switchgrass, fawny, flaxen, lasso, mulch, shotgun, doe, coltish, mildew, gunshot, spiral, cottonwood, fleece, poplar, copper, arrows, harvest, minnow, plum, moored, antler, muted, pliable, arrowhead, holster, hawk, femur, wicker, deerskin, jigsaw, mineral, absolve, pennant, sacred. I really wanted this piece to feel very grounded. It's very naturalistic. It's lived in. It's more tactile than it is intellectual. The character isn't really intellectualizing her experience, these kind of youthful emotions and what she experienced in a more tactile way. So the last piece that I went through, I think, has a really, really different linguistic ecosystem. It was for my story, Zugzwang. It has a really, really intense diction. The diction in this piece is It's a lot. The protagonist and tone of this piece are just very, very intense. And this is mostly done through the diction. The word choice pulls so much weight in this piece because the piece is so short. You don't get too much concrete information about the character. You know, I wanted in this piece to use a lot of scientific diction. You see a lot of elements and metals. The words feel a lot more complex and like cerebral rather than like tactile. You know, I was really thinking about words that felt brutal and sharp, even kind of clinical. Definitely connotations of violence going into like the main themes of this piece and this character who kind of feels like they're like a self-destruct bomb waiting to go off. The verbs were so important in this piece to create a really intense sense of movement even in a really short piece where not much actually happens on the page. The diction here definitely feels a lot more complex and it draws a lot more attention to itself. You know, the story is set in a city at night, and so I wanted it to feel like dark but also like fast-paced and kind of neon, blurry, overwhelming, like almost a little cyberpunk in a way, even though it's a realistic story. And it's interesting when you distill the linguistic ecosystem of put them back to back and you really see the distilled atmosphere of the different stories. K9, industrial, iridescent, solar plexus, bismuth, bitumen, carbon, ozone, styrofoam, saber, hydrogen, novocaine, bone meal, pharmaceutical, planetarium, meteoroid, scalpel, helix, fluorescent, tungsten, neon, live wired, carbonated, scintillate, sonic, echo, solar, cutlass, caffeine, fritz, cerebral cortex, twinge, forensic, rivet, quark, glitch, fuse, cauterize, oxidize, syzygy, electron. So such different words than what we saw in the other two stories. So much more intense. The word choice feels a lot more complex, which isn't necessarily better. Those kinds of words in there, like syzygy and scintillate, like they can almost be like too much. The story definitely has a lot more like Latin-rooted words, which can feel a lot more complex and intricate, and it really does draw attention to itself a lot more so than the subtler word choice in the previous two stories. So that's all for this video. Like I mentioned in the beginning, I've got the Google Doc linked below, which goes through all the points in the videos as well as the examples. And you know that I love talking about little writing theories that I have. Something that's just been really beneficial to me in kind of really creating that distilled atmosphere. Especially in a short story, it's really helpful to create that atmosphere that really pops, feels really distinct, but you can absolutely use this in a novel. The scale's just gonna be a lot bigger and you may have a lot more threads. But it very much does depend on the novel and how maybe like contained the setting. I will leave some other videos below on things like word choice and description. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you in another video. Bye!